morning and welcome. I'm Amy Loprest. I'm the Executive Director of the New York City Campaign Finance Board, and I want to welcome you all to today's conference, American Elections at the Crossroads. And we are indeed at a crossroads. The flood of money into our electoral process is at an all-time high, but voter turnout continues to be disappointing at best, dispiriting at worst, and Americans from all sides of the political spectrum agree that these two are related, that the moneyed interests have too much influence over our elections and our elected officials. If Americans feel that their elected officials answer more to these special interests than to the electorate, then our democracy truly is broken. Here in New York City, we have had the Small Donor Matching Funds program that has been working successfully for almost 27 years. You will hear a lot today about that program and how it encourages candidates to seek contributions from regular New Yorkers by incentivizing those contributions with a 6-to-1 match. In the 2013 municipal elections, we distributed $38.2 million in public funds. These public funds match contributions from New Yorkers in every part of the city. However, New York City still has struggled with the influx of independent spending and low voter turnout. Today, we've assembled an all-star group of moderators and panelists to discuss these problems, how we got here, and what can be done to return our democracy to the people. We're also happy to have Ann Revelle, the chair of the Federal Election Commission, as our keynote speaker. Each panel will allow time for questions, so we really hope to engage in a discussion and hear spirited questions from all of you. Finally, I'd like to take the opportunity to thank the co-sponsors of this conference, the Brennan Center for Justice, and the Committee for Economic Development. And finally, if you are tweeting, we have a hashtag dedicated for this event. It is at hashtag elections, capital R, number 4, voters. Elections are for voters. I now turn to Larry Norden, the Deputy Director of the Democracy Program, to start off our program.
Thanks, Amy, and thank you, everybody, for being here today. I think it's going to be a very interesting day. Before I start, I do want to thank the staff of the Campaign Finance Board for all the work that they put into this event, especially Matt Solars and Eric Friedman. I don't see them, but I'm sure they're here. And to Jeffrey Uden, who put a lot of work in, and she's at the Brennan Center, into this event. I am here. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce someone who really needs no introduction in this room, and that's Fritz Schwarz. I think it's fair to say, if it wasn't for Fritz, we might not be here today. Fritz's accomplishments in private practice and public service are manifold and far too many. In 1989, he chaired the successful Charter Revision Commission, which substantially revised New York City's charter. He has authored at least 3 books, including most recently Democracy in the Dark, The Seduction of Government Secrecy, and I urge, after this is over, all of you to go to Amazon and buy it. Last but not least, Fritz has worked at the Brennan Center since 2002. Among many other accomplishments, he helped to successfully defend the electioneering provisions of the McCain-Feingold campaign finance law in the U.S. Supreme Court in the case McConnell versus FEC. As chief counsel at the Brennan Center, Fritz has served as a leader and a mentor to many of the attorneys and staff, and I'm honored to include myself among those. So getting back to why we're here today and what Fritz has to do with it, back in the mid-'80s, well into Mayor Koch's second term, the city was rocked by a series of corruption scandals. The instinct for many politicians under those circumstances would probably be to try to distance themselves from those scandals and to minimize them. But Fritz urged the mayor to grab the opportunity to push for comprehensive government reform. That eventually led his successor, Peter Zimroth, and others to pass the New York City campaign public financing system, which is a big focus of our conversations today. And after that was passed into law, Fritz led the Citizens Commission that helped to get the public financing system put into the city charter. In 2003, he became just the second chair of the Campaign Finance Board in New York City, and he remained in that position until 2008. During that time, he oversaw some of the biggest changes in the city's campaign finance laws, and I'm sure that he'll tell us a little bit more about that in his remarks. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Fritz Schwarz.
Thanks so much, Larry. Thank you all for being here. Thanks to the Campaign Finance Board, co-sponsoring. Wonderful place. Come back to it. Thanks to the Committee for Economic Development, which helped to try and get New York State to reform, which we haven't succeeded in doing yet. And thanks to the Brennan Center, where, as Larry said, I've been lucky enough to work for 13 years, a period of total joy. To work with people, all of whom are at least 25 years younger than me, and most of whom are probably 50 years younger than me, that's a pretty good thing. A lot of fun, and the work is great. So let me start with something that Justice Brandeis said and something that Shakespeare said, and use those to get going into substance. Brandeis, in one of his famous dissents, had a piece of real wisdom about federalism in America, where he said, fortunately, we have a system where a courageous state can put forward innovations for examination by the rest of the country, so that a courageous state can serve as a laboratory for democracy. Well, a courageous city can do exactly the same thing, and New York City, through its campaign finance law, has served as a laboratory of democracy for our nation, and has brought us lessons which should be followed in the whole country, state by state, city by city, and the nation as a whole. Shakespeare, in As You Like It, had an expression which was, sweet are the uses of adversity. And it's true. From adversity can come good. And that has definitely been true when you think about reform in the campaign finance system and reform more generally throughout the country of the United States. Scandal has often spawned reform. We had, as Larry touched on, and I'll elaborate on in greater detail, a bad scandal in this city in the mid-'80s, and it did spawn the drive that led to the Campaign Finance Act. And today in the country, we surely do have a scandal of, as Amy, the second director of the wonderful Campaign Finance Board, said, we do have a scandal in this country of too much money in politics. The Supreme Court facilitated that phenomenon, but it surely didn't cause it. We have an enormous problem of too much money in politics, and small donor matching is a way to address that. There are other things that need to be done. The Citizens United decision needs to be reversed when we have a different Supreme Court. The culture needs to be changed. We do need to think about jurisprudence harder and recognize that it's not free speech when you pour so much money into an election that you drown out other voices and you discourage people from voting. And those are the the fundamental harms caused by money in politics that ultimately are going to lead to an overturn of the path the Supreme Court set us on and our country as a whole has embarked upon of pouring money, too much money, into elections. Now, let's talk a little bit about the law in New York and how it happened. The creation, as Larry mentioned, is definitely due to the corruption scandal that existed in New York. Actually, Ed Koch and I, from 1982, had been talking about the need to reform campaign finance. He'd made a couple of speeches about it. I had written to him 3 or 4 memos about it, but it wasn't happening. Then there were really 2 scandals in New York. The first was New York City used to be governed by something called the Board of Estimate, which the 1989 charter that I chaired finally put to death. It was a system where 8 public officials, the mayor, the controller, the city council president, which had a different name then, and the 5 borough presidents, voted on most important land use decisions, whether zoning should be changed, that's a global kind of decision, and also whether a particular developer should be allowed to build a big building in a particular place. And you began to see huge, and under New York state law, the contributions that lawfully can be given are huge. Huge contributions going to members of the Board of Estimate after a vote on either an enormously lucrative contract or a very important real estate deal. And that was something which was the beginnings of a scandal. It was a scandal, and it was bothering people. Then in 1986, or perhaps it was the end of 85, it was revealed that the borough president of Queens, the Democratic Party leader in the Bronx, and other New York City politicians were taking bribes for various deals, particularly through the Transportation Department. And this was a real scandal because it was actual bribes, not just political contributions, which are bribes disguised in another package. And the borough president of Queens ultimately killed himself, stabbing himself in the chest with a knife, as his father had done also. And the county leader, Democratic county leader in the Bronx, was convicted in a trial that Rudy Giuliani tried himself. And so Koch, Giuliani was the U.S. attorney at this time, and he clearly, in his political ambitions, wanted to go after Ed Koch in connection with these scandals. Now, Ed Koch was personally totally honest person. He really didn't care about money, and he was definitely an honest person. Nonetheless, Giuliani was going after him. The New York Post was sort of barking at him, and he was very concerned about what to do. Just a little vignette about Koch as a person. I'd been planning to leave my job as corporation counsel after 4 years plus a couple of months to stay around to argue a case in the U.S. Supreme Court. But I went to Ed and I said, Ed, I'm going to stay. I'm not going to leave after that Supreme Court argument. I'm going to stay with you until you're completely out of this effort to taint you with the corruption. And this little vignette about the mayor is not one that most people would think could possibly have happened. He actually cried when I told him that. Cried because I guess he felt that it was nice for someone to be loyal to him, and he felt grateful for that. So, as Larry said, my advice to the mayor is don't just deny it, or don't just wait. Take the offense. And I used Shakespeare's quote with him, think that adversity can be sweet, and that sweet are the uses of adversity, and take advantage of the furor about the corruption to fight for government reform. And he did for a lot of things. But definitely the most important was that there should be some kind of change in the system of money and politics in New York City. We had a legal problem, which was the state law governs the amount of money that can be given. The solution I came up with, and when I left, the New York Times wrote a nice editorial about my service as corporation counsel, and they finished saying the council should adopt this idea, but it wasn't as good idea as what the city ultimately did. But my idea was that the city would pass a law that would say any entity that gives more than X dollars in a political contribution to a city official, or whose high executive gives more than Y dollars to a city official as a political contribution, is ineligible to do business with the city. And that probably would have worked pretty well. Now, would today's Supreme Court hold it constitutional or not? I don't know. But it would have been held constitutional back then. And I think it would be held constitutional now. But after I left office, Peter Zimroth, my successor, had a much better idea of how to get around the fact that state law hangs over the New York City rules on how much can be contributed. And Peter came up with the idea, which is the structure of the law, the now campaign finance law, that if people join voluntarily, and after having joined voluntarily, they agree to limit the size of contributions and limit the amount of expenditures, then they're having acted voluntarily. There's no legal problem under state law. And that's the device that was adopted for the city system. Another hero, so Ed Koch was a hero. Actually, I think you could say he lost his primary challenge to David Dinkins in 1989 because of the campaign finance law that he had engineered. I don't think David would have beaten Ed Koch without the money that he got on a matching basis under the original campaign finance law, but that's speculation. But certainly Ed Koch was a hero because of his pushing very early, starting in 1986, for reform, fundamental, basic reform of the New York City campaign finance system. Peter Zimroth was a hero for being creative in devising a structure that would stop too much money in politics. And then the other hero was Peter Vallone Sr., who was then the Speaker of the City Council and who marshaled the law through the council, even though, as he said, it is not usual for elected officials to vote for a system that's going to finance people who are going to challenge them. So it was a remarkable act that Peter was able to get an overwhelming bipartisan, well, that's not a very important point, because when I was doing the city charter and we looked at the structure of the city government, we said, problem number one, leaving the legal problems aside, fundamental problem number one is race in the city. There's a terrible racial divide, and we should do things to help address that. Problem which we did by expanding the size of the city council, principally, that ended up with a body that was 50% minority, when before it had been about, on a smaller basis, it had been about 15% minority. And just expanding the size of districts, the number of districts, and therefore lowering the size of the districts increased the minority. And then the second real problem in the city was jealousy of Manhattan, people who don't live in Manhattan feeling they were not really taken seriously. And the third one was, and it was less important by far than the other two, but that we had really a one-party government in New York City, so that the Republican minority leader in the city council was also the only Republican in the city council. That's a little better now. You know, it's a little more representative now than it was before. But that was an aside about what we were thinking about were important to do in the charter, and Peter Vallone's job in bringing together the people who, but it still was true that he persuaded council members to vote for a bill that was going to enable people to challenge them in a realistic way. Now, another thing to talk about is the importance of how the Campaign Finance Board got started. And I would single out two things. It is not, I mean, just as a conclusion, if you compare the New York City Campaign Finance Board with the State Board of Elections or the Federal Election Commission, both of those are stalemated by partisan division. I think both of those have an even number of members, and they're the Republican members and the Democratic members, and they've developed a tradition of always voting separately and on a partisan basis, and splitting the commission and therefore disabling the commission from acting. The New York City Campaign Finance Board was set up with 5 members, 2 appointed by the mayor, 2 appointed by the council speaker, and the chairman appointed by the mayor upon notification or discussion with the council speaker. But the way it's structured, you're not going to have a division, you know, half one party, half another. The 2, leaving the chair aside, the 2 appointees of the speaker and the 2 appointees of the mayor have to come from different parties, and those have not ended up being one Democrat, one Republican, one Republican, one Democrat. There's generally been someone from a third party who is the second appointee of either the council speaker or the mayor. So you have on the commission a structure that at least encourages nonpartisan decision-making. But I think even more important than that structural point in how the Campaign Finance Board got started was the tradition established by the original chair and the original executive director. Original chair was Father Joseph O'Hare from Fordham, a marvelous man. He served for 3 terms, 15 years, and the original executive director was Nicole Gordon, who's sitting somewhere in here, who served for 18 years. And the 2 of them established a tradition within the commission members and among the staff of simply addressing things on the merits without any consideration of the partisan implications of a decision. either a decision affecting a particular individual or general decisions to be made by the board as a whole. And that tradition, certainly by the time that I came in as the second chair, that tradition was absolutely solid. You were not going to have a partisan viewpoint coming up from the staff or being taken by the board. So that tradition was enormously important, and we are greatly in debt to both Nicole and Father O'Hare. Now, the next thing is that the law, the original law, had a very important provision in it that said after each election, the Campaign Finance Board is required to hold hearings on how well or how not well the law worked and where it might be improved. And that's done after every single election. A report is required. I think the report is not just required, but the board has to recommend whether they think there are changes that should be made. And forcing the body to think about how well is it doing in achieving its objectives and what could be done to do better is a very healthy thing. And it's a public, transparent process, too. The hearings are open, and the discussion is open, and the report obviously is public. That I think has been very, very, very healthy for the Campaign Finance Board and its improvement. A lot of improvements have in fact been made. I'm going to detail some of them after concentrating on what I think is the single most important improvement that's been made over the course of the history of the Campaign Finance Board. And that is the changes in the matching fund amount and multiplier. The first law provided for a one-to-one match on the first $1,000. Then in the summer of 2000, I know it was in 2000, the law was changed to a 4-to-1 match on the first 250,000. Then in, I think, 07 or 06, the law was changed to a 6-to-1 match on the first 175,000. Going back to the change to 4-to-1, this was the second time that I personally got involved in these issues, the first having been with Koch and pushing for there being a major new law. But Mayor Giuliani, for some reason, brought a lawsuit saying it was illegal to change from 1-to-1 on 1,000 to 4-to-1 on 250. And the Campaign Finance Board, and Nicole, I guess it was, I'm sure it was, asked me to do an amicus brief and to intervene on behalf of candidates in the forthcoming election of 2001 in defense of the 4-to-1 match, the change to a 4-to-1 match. And I did that, and we got about 40 affidavits from candidates for the forthcoming election, candidates for every office, the citywide offices, the borough presidents, and the council. And the basic thrust of all of those affidavits was, we will change our method of campaigning if smaller gifts are given a larger match. And this was very effective facts put forward by people ranging from candidates to mayor to candidates for lots of city council offices. But let's jump ahead to the 6-to-1 match and then talk about its impact. Actually, I proposed an 8-to-1 match, and that was opposed by the new mayor, Mayor Bloomberg, I'm not quite sure what his logic was, but he did oppose it, and what came out was a 6-to-1 match on the first 175. And there are some studies that show what that has in fact done, and it has done what those affidavits predicted the lesser change of 4-to-1 on 250 would do. It has changed the behavior of candidates running for office in New York City, and I think Michael Malbin has done some research on this that's very powerful and very important. Because what it does is give people an incentive to, instead of dialing for big dollars, going to meet people for small dollars. And you can see what it can do. You get 6-to-1 on the first $50. It's on the first 175. But let's say you're someone who can't possibly give more than $50. But when you're told that if you give 50, the candidate's going to get 350, 6 times 50 plus the original 50, that's a real incentive. And it has incentivized people to participate in campaigns. And by the way, a little aside on that related to that subject. Some reformers act and talk as if any gift of money is a bad thing. Money's bad, giving too much money is bad, therefore giving any money is bad. Well, there's a logical flaw in there. It's giving too much money that's bad. Giving a small amount of money is a good thing. It does energize people and convince them that they're part of the effort. President Obama, in his first campaign, in the huge amounts of money he got from small gifts, definitely that not only helped him from the point of view of getting the money, but it helped him because if you give, you are a participant, you are interested, and the opportunity to be matched increases the likelihood that you will give. So the impact on democracy of the increased matches has been very great, and out of this conference maybe will come ideas that you could even increase further the impact of, let's say, small contributions below $100, but increase that impact further, and I'm sure it would have a great impact on the New York City's politics and continue New York's role as a laboratory for democracy. So just to tick off a few other things, not as important, I think, but really important that the city did do often and usually in response to the required analysis by the Campaign Finance Board after every election. They required candidates for citywide office to participate in debates. So if you're in the program and you're way ahead, you can't say, oh, I'm not going to bother to debate. You have to debate if you're in the program. Then it eliminated corporate contributions. It required more disclosure. Most recently, the city charter was amended to require disclosure of independent expenditures. And the law was changed to say that even if you're not in the program, the disclosure obligations apply to you and the limits on contributions apply to you. So there have been a lot, and there are many more, and no doubt Amy, when she talks in her part, or if people ask her a question, could talk about additional changes that were made on behalf of the Campaign Finance Board to help the city have an even stronger law. So now to finish up and give you a chance to get on to the great programs, I think the city has been a highly successful laboratory for democracy, and we were lucky that we had adversity and responded to it, and the challenge in the city is to continue to improve, and the challenge in the nation is to respond to the adversity of too much money in politics and get a program like the city's program that at least is going to be an alternative to the corrupting system that we now have where there's much too much money in politics. So thank you all.
Speak from their seats? Yeah, I think so, yeah. That's my preference. Okay, yeah. Oh, and then Brad,
How you doing? Can you hear me okay? Excellent.
we'll start with the Congressman, and then Jay, and then me.
Great. I can.
How are you?
When I my speech, I'm going to mute and cut off the video during the rest of the panel, and then I'll come back on later. Yeah.
Could I have you take your seats, please? Could I have you take your seats, please?
Jay, Costa. Hi, Brad. Did you do a presentation of civic? I did. So I saw you there.
All righty. Good morning. You can do better than that.
Good morning.
All right. I have to do that to my students as well. My name is Ciara Torres-Spelliscy, and I teach election law in Florida, where they sorely need it. But before that, I was here at the Brennan Center working on the issue of money in politics. And I think one of the big questions that confronts us is what types of reforms can one even do after Citizens United? Interestingly, Zephyr Teachout, who ran for governor in the state of New York, said that she thought it was more important to get public financing for states than to reverse Citizens United. And perhaps we can discuss that provocative thought a little bit later. But first, we have a wonderful panel of speakers to talk about reform tactics to address the issue of money in politics, and to discuss some of the legal and constitutional boundaries that these reforms must occupy in light of Citizens United, Bennett, McCutcheon, and other cases. Our first speaker is joining us via Skype. Congressman Sarbanes, are you there?
I'm here.
Okay. Congressman Sarbanes, could you please kick us off?
Well, thank you very much, Ciara. I appreciate the opportunity, and thank you all for indulging me remotely this way. Today we'll have the ability to vote by Skype, and I'll be able to be with you and do this in reverse. But we had 2 votes today that are going to be coming this morning, so I wanted to make sure I was here for those. I want to first off thank the Brennan Center for the amazing work that it continues to do, and also the Committee for Economic Development for being such responsible and enlightened and constructive voice in the business community, stepping up behind different public policy questions, including for many years this issue of how we reform our campaign finance system. And I know there's a lot of other organizations in the room that will be represented on the various panels today. They've done really terrific work in this space for many, many years, and I want to thank you for your efforts as well and for being part of a broad and growing coalition of people, organizations across the country that have decided that their efforts to achieve real reform will not be denied ultimately. I wanted to talk a little bit about my effort here on Capitol Hill, H.R. 20, the Government by the People Act. To give you the context for that, I view the efforts to kind of fight back against big money in politics and pursue a reform agenda as falling into two baskets. The first is what I'll call rules-based reform, the idea that we put certain rules in place to try to constrain or limit or contain the influence of the big money players out there. And in that basket, you will find disclosure and transparency, a very important initiative that we've taken up here on the Hill, which is to give the public more information about where the money's coming from to hopefully help them make a more informed judgment on the effect of that money. So transparency and disclosure is one of the rules that we try to put in place. Non-coordination rules, which, as you know, are largely being observed in the breach right now. It's a very complex area, but those are important as well, particularly as we see this winking and nodding that goes on between the super PACs and the candidates that they support. So that's another important place that we can try to pursue reform. The constitutional amendment effort, which I support, it's a tough road to hoe. But again, the concept is, can we put some limits in place to try to contain or restrain the influence that the big money players are having out there through independent expenditures? So those are examples of rules-based reform of the system to try to address the undue influence that money is having. And those are important. There's another basket, though. There's another place we can turn to combat the influence of big money and pursue these efforts, and that's what I call power-based reform. And the idea is there to compete with the influence of big money by finding another place where power on behalf of everyday citizens can be collected and kind of push back and compete with that influence. And really what we're talking about is compete for the attention of candidates and members of Congress, people like myself. The reality is that candidates and people who are serving here on Capitol Hill, they will raise money where it can be raised. They will turn towards those sources of funding that allow them to be competitive in their campaign. And right now, if you want to be competitive, if you want to raise $1.5 million or so that it costs on average to win a campaign for Congress every 2 years, there's really only one place you can go to raise that kind of money in the amounts and as rapidly as you need to be competitive. And that's it's the deep-pocketed donors, it's the special interests. They're the ones who have the money, and candidates will go there to raise that money. If we could create a different place where candidates could go to raise the money to be competitive, I think candidates would be interested in that. And if that were a place where most Americans live, then we would create a completely different orientation for the political system. Candidates would turn towards everyday citizens to power their campaign. So that's what power-based reform looks like. It's a different approach than the rules-based approach. One reason I like the power-based concept, this empowerment frame, is that rules, as we've seen, and I know you've already had some discussion there today, but rules, as we've seen, money often finds a way to get around the rules. It's like getting around a rock water. Power, on the other hand, can't be denied. And so if you can respond to the power of big money with the power of small donors, then you've really created a solution that I think is inspiring to everyday citizens out there and can kind of collect their energy and direct it. That's the premise of H.R. 20, the Government by the People Act. We wanted to create something that would empower small donors to get the candidates and kind of weigh in again on their own democracy. So let me describe very briefly what that is. When we get into the panel discussion and the Q&A, I can certainly answer more questions. The Government by the People Act has three basic components to it. The first is a small donor tax credit, and the idea behind that is to give every American a $25 refundable tax credit for contributions to congressional campaigns. The idea there is if we're going to build a system that is dependent on the engagement of small donors, we need to make it a little bit easier for the average person out there to get into the game. And $25 or $50 or $75 contribution for most Americans is still a pretty heavy lift when you lay it against the other expenses they have. So we wanted to make it easier for them to make that contribution. That's what the refundable tax credit is designed to do, and we can talk more about the specs on that tax credit later if you'd like. So that gets people into the game. The second piece, which is absolutely critical, and people in New York are familiar with this concept, as are others around the country who are in state-based small donor matching systems. But that is to bring in a match, a multiple match of public dollars behind that small donation. We do that at the rate of 6 to 1. So it's very reminiscent of the New York City system in that regard. And we do it for donations, small donations, up to $150 per person. So someone gives a $50 donation, they now are actually worth $350 to the candidate. They qualify, a candidate qualifies for that match if they meet certain requirements. They have to build a small donor network. They have to agree to limit the high donation level that they receive, bring that down from the current limit of $2,700 per individual per election to $1,000. So that helps bring down that upper limit of private donations. And they have to agree to give optional PAC money if they want to qualify. But if they do all those things, then they can earn the match, the 6 to 1 match on small donations. The tax credit and the match really work together. A tax credit by itself, while it may get more donors to join the game, small donors, frankly, is not enough for the candidate to seek out those donors. It's the match that makes it worth it to the candidate to go find the power that resides in everyday citizens. And we think those work very well together to energize the candidates to build a campaign that will find small donors and bring them in. The third piece of our bill is an opportunity for candidates to access some additional public funds in the home stretch of a campaign, the last 60 days, to maybe help them weather the storm that could come at them in terms of outside money or super PAC money. It's not designed as a trigger mechanism, so it doesn't get tangled up in the jurisprudence of this Supreme Court. We made sure that that was the case. But the combination of these three elements would be very empowering to small donors and would fundamentally, I think, change the behavior of candidates here on Capitol Hill. I'll close with a couple final observations. First, this is a very practical design. We built a model to run the numbers, the fundraising numbers from 2014 of my colleagues here on the Hill to see how they would fare using certain assumptions, how they would fare under this proposal if they joined a public financing system of the kind I've just described to you. And we determined that nearly 80% of my colleagues would do as well or better in terms of the money they could raise under the system we're proposing than they actually did in 2014. And that's critical in terms of selling this to my colleagues, because a lot of them will say to me, well, Sarbanes, you know, this is great in theory, but I got to live in the real world and raise money. And I can come back at them and say, well, we ran your numbers, and you'll be living in a world where you'll have more resources and more credibility with the public, because you'll be basing the financing of your campaign on small donors and the leverage that they can have over the system. The last comment I'll make is we think the motivation out there in the electorate, in the citizenry, to get behind this kind of reform will come from helping people connect the dots between issues that they care about and the undue influence that might have in Washington in terms of blocking progress on those issues. So even though I'm quite aware as a member of Congress moving around my district, that when it comes to politics, most Americans have left the building and run up into the hills, we can go find them using the issue they care most deeply about and lead them back into the political town square. So someone who cares about the environment, but may have fled the political discourse, we can say to them, if you care about climate change, if you care about cleaning up our environment, moving towards renewable energy, then let me explain to you how the oil and gas industry is having influence over the policy in Washington because of the amount of money they pour into campaign. And once that connection is understood, then you bring that back into the town square as a champion of campaign reform so that they can make progress. If we relieve that dependence on special interests, they can see progress on the issue that matters to them. For these reasons, I think the time is right to push a power-based reform solution along with the kind of rules-based efforts that are underway. And it has the fine, I think, inspirational dimension that it brings everyday citizens out of the bleachers onto the field, not just putting a referee on the field to blow the whistle when some super PAC gives a candidate a steroids injection, but actually saying we're going to come onto the field, we're going to be players again, power players in our own democracy. That's a real motivator. I think it can be the game changer this time around. So thank you for the opportunity to be on the panel today. I think I went a little bit over, and I apologize for that. I'll try and keep my answers shorter on the back end. I'll turn it back to you, Ciara. Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman. Mr. Costa.
Hi, my name is Jay Costa, and I am the executive director of a group called CounterPAC, which seeks to advance the issue of money in politics reform by creating incentives for candidates to bring reform to their own campaign practices, and thereby creating models of reform in action. So I'd like to start today by sharing with you all our general theory of politics, which is that at the end of the day, it's kind of like a game. And in this game, the candidates are the players, and the way they win this game is by getting elected to office. Now, in order to do that, they need to persuade voters to vote for them, which in turn takes money. Seeing as you're all here this morning, I'm going to go ahead and assume that you know about the huge magnitudes of money that it takes, and probably even think that it's a problem that it takes so much money. So I'm not going to spend time trying to convince you of that, but instead I'm going to focus on talking about if we want to change the rules of this game and reduce the influence that money has in it, how we might go about doing that. Now, like any player in any game, what candidates want most is to win. And so they're going to do whatever it takes to win. And as long as money is a key part of the strategy for winning, they're not going to be the ones to change the rules of this game and reduce the influence that money has. So we need to seek another point of leverage. Now, the most obvious one, we already know that candidates need to get votes. So if we could convince voters that this problem is so bad and get them angry enough that they're, ready to hold politicians accountable at the ballot box, then perhaps we could force politicians to take charge and change the rules of this game. The problem here is that, as it turns out, upwards of 90% of people think the problem of money in politics in our country is so bad that it's basically intractable, that it's basically impossible for us to solve it. And effectively they're looking at the situation that we have at hand here and saying, rather than, wow, this game stinks, let's get together and do something to change it, that corruption is inevitable, that it's just part of how the game is played. And so why would you get involved? Why would you try? Because it's really just a losing battle. It's not something we're ever going to be able to solve. So what we have here is a vicious cycle. Start with corruption, see how bad things are, and this makes people cynical. And the cynicism causes accountability mechanisms to fail because the public is apathetic, rather than going to the voting booth and holding politicians accountable for making reform happen, people are staying at home. And when these accountability mechanisms fail, that allows corruption to get worse, which breeds more cynicism, and round we go in this vicious cycle. So if we want to change the way that this game is played, we need to break this cycle. We need to restore accountability mechanisms, and to do that, we need to basically break this cycle of cynicism and restore public hope, restore the expectation that reform is possible. So we need people to basically look at the state of things and say, it doesn't have to be this way, let's work together to make change. Now you might ask, how do we do that? Well, the same way that you convince anyone of anything, you use examples. Fortunately, we have a really great example of the game being played differently. It came in 2012. Elizabeth Warren and Scott Brown made a really simple agreement that radically altered the way that their campaign was run. They came together and they signed a pledge that said, if any outside money is spent on my campaign, that is, by a super PAC or other sort of outside group, I'll take money out of my own campaign account and let my opponent donate it to a charity of their choice. So what they're doing here is basically creating a really strong disincentive for outside groups to spend. Because if you're a super PAC and you want to help a candidate, if you try to spend on their behalf, you're really ultimately just going to hurt them because they're going to have to take money out of their own campaign account to offset it. So it's a neat agreement, and even neater is the fact that it actually worked quite well. So relative to other competitive Senate races that year, outside spending was reduced by 93%, negative advertising is cut in half, and small donations exceeded outside spending by a factor of 3 to 1. So some really, really great results, and when we saw this, quite frankly, we were inspired. It's a great example of politicians coming together, reaching across the aisle, and taking action that has meaningful outcomes. And so we thought, what we really need as a movement, if we want to change the role that money in politics is playing, we need more examples like this. And so the whole idea behind CounterPAC is basically to try to seed more examples like this of reform working. So in 2014, we launched a pilot campaign to see what we could do in this regard. And we decided to start with a slightly different problem than all outside spending writ large. We decided to start with the problem of dark money. And we did this not only because it's a huge burgeoning problem, it's grown immensely over the last half dozen years and is expected to continue to grow, but because it also, disclosure as an issue has a wide amount of support across the ideological spectrum. And so, we thought that this would be a politically viable place to start. With the problem in hand, what we needed was a pledge-based solution similar to that that Warren and Brown enacted. And so we actually used their agreement as a model and really just slightly amended it to focus on dark money instead of outside money. Now that we have our problem and our solution, what we need are incentives to basically get candidates to take up the solution that we're trying to push. So like any other advocacy campaign, our work starts with an ask, please take this action, and it looks like formal letters, phone calls to the campaign. But the real incentive comes from another feature of CounterPAC, which I've yet to mention, which is, drumroll please, that we are also a super PAC. And so basically, implicit in our ask is the possibility that we could get involved in a race to spend for or against a candidate if we so choose. Now, we're a very weird super PAC in that at the start of every campaign, we are completely agnostic about who should win. We don't have any party affiliation. We don't have any favorites entering